Good evening, everyone. It's such a pleasure to have you here tonight. My name is Joel Lohr. I'm the president here at Hartford Seminary. So welcome. And we have a great night tonight. This is the William, I guess it's technically, as a Dutch person, I should get this right. Wilhelm, or he went by Wim, actually. Willem A. Bielefeld. This lecture is named after him. I'll say more about him in a moment, but let me first say something about Hartford Seminary, and I don't want to miss this opportunity. Hartford Seminary, as many of you know, is a place of firsts, and I won't list them all tonight, but one that I think deserves mention is that Hartford Seminary is the first seminary in America to admit women in 1889, and we're proud of that. And so, in light of our topic tonight, I thought it would be important to mention that, to know that Hartford Seminary has some very deep feminist roots. So Dr. Wim Bielefeld retired from Hartford Seminary in 1990 after serving for 25 years as professor of Islamic studies, academic dean, the editor of the Muslim World, and founder and director of the McDonald Center for the Study of Islam and Muslim-Christian Relations. He passed away in 2014. According to the tribute that was paid to him in the Muslim World on the occasion of his retirement, it says this: Professor Bielefeld not only inspired students, but assisted churches to adopt many of his interfaith insights into their own ministries. Having read a good number of biographies today, actually, I spent a bit of time reading up on him. I'd heard about him, but spent more time today. I can say that he was indeed an impressive figure, an inspiring individual, and I especially like this line, one that I read in a little tribute to him. It said, Professor Bielefeld was a real scholar. He knew all the sources. He was a walking encyclopedia. The Muslims he interacted with thought he was Islamic. I think that's a good, I always like it when my students at the end of a course say, are you Jewish? Are you Christian? Are you Muslim? Like, what, you know, or they can't figure it out. I think we should present these things often in such a way that we're sympathetic enough. At least maybe they're going to figure it out after a little while, but the first few classes, you got to keep them guessing. This lecture, named in his honor, brings a distinguished scholar to our campus for a public lecture, a public presentation on Islam and Christian-Muslim relations to promote interreligious understanding and mutual respect in the local, national, and world communities. I'm delighted that we have attracted such a distinguished scholar tonight, a scholar, a teacher, an author, a parent. We met her daughter today. We had a wonderful dinner with her this evening. She's also a delightful human being. I think we can all attest to that who spent some time with her today. To introduce her, I'm going to invite our academic dean, Reverend Dr. David Grafton, if you don't mind, to bring an introduction of our speaker.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Reverend Dr. David Grafton, Academic Dean, Professor of Islamic Studies and Christian-Muslim Relations here at the seminary. So, as you heard, our scholar for this Bielefeld lecture is Dr. Jerusha Rhodes, Associate Professor of Islam and Interreligious Engagement at Union Theological Seminary in New York. Now, when I met her this evening at the door, and I asked her, what is one word that would describe you? What one word do you think would describe you if I'm going to introduce you? And we turned to her daughter, and her daughter said, intense. We'll see what kind of intense lecture we have tonight. I don't know. Yeah. Dr. Rhodes earned a PhD in Theological and Religious Studies with a focus on religious pluralism at Georgetown University in 2011. She also received an MA in Islamic Sciences at the Graduate School of Islamic and Social Sciences and an MA in Theological and Religious Studies at Georgetown. Before joining the faculty at Union in 2012, she was a visiting assistant professor at the Department of Theology at Georgetown. Dr. Rhodes' research focuses on theologies of religious pluralism, comparative theology, and Muslima theology. Dr. Rhodes' first book, Never Wholly Other, A Muslima Theology of Religious Pluralism in 2014, explores the Quranic discourse on religious otherness. Her second book, which we will be hearing about tonight, Divine Words, Female Voices, Muslima Explorations in Comparative Feminist Theology, uses the approach of comparative feminist theology to engage diverse Muslim and Christian feminist, womanist, and muristic voices. I spent some time this past week reading the book. Dr. Rhodes has argued brilliantly in this work that, quote, comparative feminist theology is not simply an interesting add-on to the role of women's piety, practices, and socialization in their faiths. Rather, her exploration cuts to the heart of the experience of faith. Now, I am acutely aware of the irony of a white Christian male who teaches Islamic studies introducing a Muslima feminist scholar, that I may be in many ways participating in much of what she describes in her book as, quote, the complicated, larger, and extremely charged discourse of Islam in North America, which could potentially thwart or oppress the important roles, and here I quote, of the important identity, authority, and voices of women. But I hope I don't. Ultimately, I can't be the arbiter of such a critique. That's not my job. Only someone like Dr. Rhodes is able to respond to that. And so, without further ado, we look forward to hearing directly from her voice, maybe her intense voice this evening. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jerusha Rhodes.
Okay, see, I was just going to move this, and because I knew this was going to happen, so I'm going to displace this from the stage. That was my attempt to get myself water before I realized that someone had gotten me water. Okay, wonderful. It's so nice to be here this evening. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, wonderful. Those of you who know me or have come to one of my talks before will know that I tend to move around a lot. I am a mobile thinker, and so I am going to do my best to stay here and speak into the microphone. And if at any time I am over there, you should just be like, I can't hear you, and I will get the hand signal and come back here so that you can hear me. I am aware that my need to move around is less than people's need to hear me and see me and have access to what I am doing tonight. So I want to begin by saying thank you. Thank you to Hartford Seminary. Thank you to President Laura. Thank you especially to Susan, who has organized and facilitated all of the logistics. As someone who loves details, part of maybe the intensity that you will have heard about and may see, we'll assess that later. I really appreciate the organization and the attention and care and concern. I will also, just in full disclosure, say that this front row over here is occupied with people with whom I share DNA, and I cannot be fully accountable for what may or may not transpire. So one of them is my child, and the other four are aunts and uncles who live in the Connecticut area, because this is where my family is from, so yay. And it's a pleasure to give a talk and have family present, as well as all of you. And so with that, let's go. Tonight, what I want to do, and I have prepared some remarks just to keep us on track and keep us on time so we have some time for conversation as well. But what I want to do tonight is discuss a bit about the why, the how, and the what of this most recent book, Divine Words, Female Voices, Muslim Explorations in Comparative Feminist Theology. Why, meaning why I wrote this book. How, meaning the methodology that I use in the book, as was mentioned before, Comparative Feminist Theology. And then what? Some of the constructive takeaways. If you read the book, you're going to see that there's a lot of constructive takeaways. It is a work in constructive feminist, Islamic feminist theology. And for those of you who are well-versed in that field, you know that there are constructive works, and I will speak about this in a moment, but it is also true that there is a heavy deconstructionist move within the field, meaning that a lot of effort is spent critiquing and deconstructing what exists. I'm interested in both the deconstruction, but also the reconstruction and construction of new ideas, of new voices, of new possibilities, of new rituals. So the why, the how, and the what. If I say anything tonight, because I'm acutely aware that there are people here who are experts in Islam, experts in Christianity, people who are just interested, we all come with different competencies. So please, if I use a word, say something, it's not clear, that's what our conversation time will be for. I'm happy to clarify, go deeper, go less deep, whatever is necessary. Okay? So let's start. Why? This book is both an intervention and a response. It is an intervention into ongoing and ambivalent debates over the relationship between Islam and feminism. As was mentioned before, as I like to say over and over again, this relationship is complex. So that book is 360 pages of complex. I'm just going to take my word for it tonight. It's a complex relationship. There are many Muslim scholars who fervently promote women's equality. Ambivalence, though, arises from the concern that dominant forms of feminism and feminist theology are not expressive of and potentially oppressive to the experiences, challenges, and liberative strategies of diverse Muslim women. In a way, this ambivalence is connected to an assertion of identity, autonomy, and voice that highlights diversity among women and among religious identities and traditions. Ambivalence, though, is not simply an assertion of identity, autonomy, and voice. It is also a position adopted in reaction to various discourses that emerge outside of and from within the Islamic tradition. These include external critiques of Islam that are grounded in notions of cultural superiority and that propagate negative stereotypes of Islam and Muslim women. I don't think I need to provide you with examples. You can watch the news this evening. These critiques can give rise to efforts that ostensibly aim to improve the situation, notably singular and homogeneous, of all Muslim women, but rarely do they actually attend to the voices and concerns of Muslim women. Islam is portrayed as other, as backward, as devoid of egalitarian possibilities. Muslim women are portrayed as being in need of rescue from Islam, and particularly from Muslim men. And as a result, rigorous and extensive efforts by Muslim women to search for and reclaim egalitarian precedent and resources within the Islamic tradition are ignored and dismissed. From within the Islamic tradition, ambivalence is fueled by the existence of patriarchy and androcentrism, that is, male rule or dominance and male normativity, meaning that the male occupies the center space. When you think of a human, you think of a male human. We don't call them a male human, we just say they're human, and we take those characteristics as the norm. As part, although certainly not all, of Islamic tradition, these realities result in texts and practices that enshrine, normalize, and operationalize hierarchical views of humanity. They also result in attacks and rejections of interpretations of the Islamic tradition that promote egalitarianism, equality, and women's rights. Such interpretations are often labeled as feminist, as Western, as deviations, and, wait for it, un-Islamic. The authority of egalitarian interpretations is effectively undercut by presenting such interpretations as external impositions on a pure Islam. Again, a singular pure Islam. Muslim scholars are well aware that their work can be dismissed and, more significantly, rendered impotent, meaning incapable of changing anything, when it is caricatured as a product of external forces. Keep in mind that these external forces have a concrete historical and contemporary record of negatively approaching Islam and Muslim women. These external and internal discourses append specific and frequently oppositional definitions to Islam and feminism, and thereby seek to define what counts as an authentic expression of Islam. In doing so, they fuel the ambivalence of Muslim scholars towards feminism in general, and thus also obscure other valuable possibilities, specifically those related to interreligious feminist engagement. These discourses stifle, if not prevent, deep conversations and informed solidarity among women across religious traditions. They pit women and various formulations of feminism against each other. They capitalize off of superficial knowledge of traditions and of feminisms, and they convince many women that such conversations are of abundant risk and little benefit. Why does all of this matter? Because this book is also a response to growing calls within Islamic feminist and egalitarian scholarship for new, constructive methods and approaches. As I was mentioning before, and as Hiba Abou-Dugheri observes, the deconstructive approach remains the dominant method of Islamic feminism within the United States. Part of the reason for this relates to the limitations of the academic disciplines and positions which many Muslim women scholars in the United States hold. This positioning is not always amenable to scholar activists or scholar theologians who advocate constructive possibilities related to Islam, women, and gender. Deconstructive challenges to patriarchy, androcentrism, and hegemony are invaluable. Yet constructive rethinking is also required for egalitarian interpretations to become more robust and actually transformational. Deconstruction will never create a new horizon. It will tear down ones that need to be torn down, but the imagining of what the new is a different sort of task. In line with more recent contributions from Amina Wadud, Aisha Chowdhury, and Saadia Sheikh, new constructive approaches that go beyond textual interpretation, historical reclamation, and identification of past egalitarian precedent must be articulated and implemented, not only to contend with negative stereotyping and male dominance outside of the tradition, but also to articulate new ways of asserting authority both within and outside of Muslim communities. It is my contention, and the central wager of this book, that interreligious feminist engagement is a vital resource for developing one such new approach. It is a theologically legitimate and practically necessary resource. Interreligious feminist engagement can be a rich source of insights in the ongoing development of an Islamic feminist theology if, and watch the if, because it's a very important if historical, comparative, and epistemological challenges are identified, confronted, and skillfully navigated. Just an aside, One cannot enter in the U.S. context into interreligious feminist solidarity or scholarship without attention to power dynamics. To pretend that they don't exist is just to step right into a violent space. They exist. My contention is that we can do something about that. So let's move to how. What can we do? How do we do this? Is there a method or a form of engagement that would mitigate against the common challenges and open doors to meaningful interreligious engagement? The short answer is yes. You're here for the middle answer. The long answer is the book. The short answer, yes. You're going to get a medium-sized answer. This answer begins with the acknowledgement that interreligious feminist engagement is not actually new. More pertinently, it has not always been a productive endeavor. We must acknowledge the challenges and realities of much interreligious feminist engagement, especially Muslim-Christian engagement, especially Muslim-Christian engagement in the U.S. context. As Aisha Hidayatullah and Zain Qasim aptly note, while assumed to be beneficial, Muslim-Christian engagement can be a site of harm and jeopardy due to power and structural issues. It is often characterized by language and concerns being drawn from or determined by Christian traditions. So for instance, we'll say, let's have an interfaith panel, and we'll say, what will be the topic? Well, let's have the topic be grace, or the topic will be love, or the topic, we're going to talk about our Bibles, like the Muslim Bible, the Quran, right? Drawing the language and concerns from one tradition, and in this case, the dominant tradition. A framing of rivalry, myths about liberating Muslim women, myths about Muslim women needing to catch up. Maybe eventually they'll catch up. And a persistent lack of knowledge across traditions. All of these create expectations and assumptions of parity across traditions. For example, that Muslim and Christian women would have similar questions about and concerns and approaches related to their respective scriptures, the Quran and the Bible. I often tell people that I have sat on many a panel where people have said, when will you start using our biblical exegetical methods for interpreting the Quran? It's a power move. It's a move that demonstrates lack of understanding of the internal infrastructure of diverse traditions. And it's also a move that will end the conversation. We don't want to do that. We don't want to do that, okay? Despite these very real challenges, this is the happy part of the story. Interreligious feminist engagement is both theologically and practically necessary. Theologically speaking, and this is a topic of my first book, which was mentioned before, so I'm not really going to go into great detail. But theologically speaking, if the Quran describes the existence of multiple religious traditions as intentional, as divinely intended, as an ayatullah, as a sign of God, and for those of you who study Islamic theology, I won't go in depth, but a sign of God is something that when you reflect on it, you consider it, it gives you greater understanding of God. So plants are signs of God, and nature, and we are signs of God, and the Quran is a sign of God, and Revelation. If the Quran is describing other religious traditions in this language and through this metaphor, if traditions are described in this way, then there is an imperative to engage that diversity. And let me say something here. Engage that diversity. Not just say we respect it. Not just say the Quran says positive things about other traditions. You engage with the signs of God. They demand discernment. They demand reflection. The Quran does not say, those of you who say there are signs of God. It says, those of you who reflect upon, who think about, who use your reason to engage. So engage that diversity beyond mere tolerance or valuing. This book is very much motivated by that theological imperative and justification. There is something to be learned from and amid diversity. Practically speaking, since interreligious feminist engagement is already happening, sometimes implicitly, sometimes unnamed, and sometimes premised upon unproductive caricatures, Islamic feminism is embedded in an inherently comparative setting. For those of us who do work in the U.S. context, there is simply no escaping this comparative backdrop. We will engage with it in some way, whether it will be passively, poorly, or productively is perhaps the only question. Since comparative engagement is going on, strategies for explicit and conscientious comparative engagement are necessary. The question is not whether to engage, but how to engage. It is a question of method. On a more positive practical note, there is something, many things to learn. While it is accurate that hegemonic and universal feminisms stifle the agency of diverse Muslim women, it is also true that this is not the whole reality of religious feminisms. There are many scholars and theologians across traditions who have critiqued these forms of feminism and articulated other variations such as womanism, Moharista theology, African women's theology, decolonial theology, due to very similar concerns as those voiced by Muslim women scholars. This alone indicates that we have much to learn from each other. The specific how, the method that I propose in this book, is the approach of comparative feminist theology. Comparative feminist theology is specific and technical, so we're going to go into some of the details here because it is not just engaging across traditions. And it is precisely the method that holds at bay some of the potential hazards, if that makes sense. So we'll detail some of the things. Comparative feminist theology builds critically upon the general method of comparative theology. Some of you may be familiar with this field. Defined by Francis X. Clooney, comparative theology describes, beginning of the quote, acts of faith seeking understanding, which are rooted in a particular faith tradition, but which venture into learning from one or more other traditions. And here's the important, it's all important. Okay, that's going to be recorded and he'll see that. So it's all important. But this is especially important, the why. For the sake of fresh theological insights. Comparative theology is the double process of venturing out of one's tradition or traditions to learn deeply about and from other traditions, and then returning to one's own tradition or traditions with new insights, questions, and perspectives. More specifically, it is a process that begins, and watch the order, begins with deep learning about the other on their own terms. Then, limited acts of competent comparison. Competent, meaning knowledgeable, informed comparison. And then, constructive theological reflection. The order is important. Comparative feminist theology follows this basic process with a few key modifications. First, it centers what Michelle Voss-Roberts calls the outsider within various traditions. Rather than insider orthodoxies, it focuses on feminist discourse, texts, and practices. Second, it revisits the way in which the fruits, meaning those fresh theological insights of comparative theological engagement, are received by and resonate with the original tradition. Communal resonance is important, but feminist theologies are more interested in provocative communal resonance. Comparative theology is very interested in the fact that the theological insights you garner from this exchange will be brought back to your community, and your community will go, aha, yes, this makes sense. But understand that in a feminist discourse, feminists even within their own tradition aren't getting the, aha, this makes sense. They're often getting the, be quiet, and what are you talking about? And why are you bringing corrupt external stuff into the tradition anyhow? So what feminist theologians want here is to resonate with other outsiders within, okay? To have that kind of resonance. Third, comparative feminist theology is especially attentive to expectations of parity in concerns, methods, and theology. Fourth, comparative feminist theology does not avoid all grand narratives, as is often asserted by early comparative theologians. Comparative feminist theology aims to use theological insights for a goal, and that is to foster deep solidarity and further equality. In the comparative theological process, we understand ourselves in new ways in light of the other. It is important to emphasize that this does not mean that the objective is appropriation or direct co-optation or abandonment of one's own tradition or traditions. It is an assertion that we notice new facets of ourselves, our traditions, our sources, our practices when they are illuminated by comparative engagement. We ask new questions of our traditions. We discover new patterns hidden beneath grooves of well-worn narratives. We see new possibilities. Sometimes I tell my students that it's like sitting in this room, and you could come to this room every day for class or lecture or to give a talk. It's the same room. But imagine if I turn off the lights up there. New shadows. Maybe you never noticed the piano. Oh, is the carpet really that color? See new things. Of vital importance in comparative feminist theology, we are prompted to imagine new, legitimate, and rooted options beyond dominant forms of theology, interpretation, and practice. The comparative lens assists in penetrating what Muhammad Arkoun would call the unthought and the unthinkable. That is, those possibilities within our own tradition that are obscured by dominant formulations of orthodoxy and interpretations of texts and practices. The goals of comparative feminist theology, therefore, are transformation, transgression, and imaginative theological reconstruction within and in conversation with the traditions of the comparative theologian. At the same time, comparative feminist theology provides a way to learn with other traditions and to gain indispensable insights related to egalitarianism, interrogations of power, attentiveness to on-the-ground realities, and a thrust towards liberation become empowering aspects of comparative feminist theology. Engagement among traditions becomes a theologically sound, theologically rich, and practically effective means of change. It reveals new resources crucial to our own particular struggles. Rather, as was mentioned, it's good when my quotes are going to align with the quotes of the person who introduced me, rather than a distraction or a side project. Comparative feminist theology recasts interreligious feminist engagement as an invaluable resource for reflection and action. So let's talk about the what. Two of the most helpful aspects of this method of comparative theology are, one, that it is premised upon deep knowledge. Remember, I mentioned the order. We're not talking about, I want to compare things, this looks the same in your tradition and the same in my tradition, let's compare. No. Step one is you have to commit to the learning. If that's ritual learning, if that's communal learning, if that's theological learning, the learning is imperative. It is premised upon deep knowledge. And number two, that it is not premised upon expectations of absolute parity or sameness. Comparative feminist theology is not the search for how we're all the same. In fact, there's no work to be done. The conversation is over. Commonalities are important, but that is not the sole focus, and that is actually not where I have anything to learn. Where I have something to learn from every one of you is where we don't align, right? It's in the places where we might overlap, but also be different. Why does this matter? I like to ask myself questions. I'm sorry, we keep the process going. Why does this matter? Simply, it allows comparative feminist theologians to identify better points of analogy, better places to start comparative conversations. In this book, and hence the title, the unique starting point that I take up is a reorientation around the analogy of the two divine words. That is, centering comparative theological reflection on the analogy between the Quran and Jesus, instead of the other common alternatives of comparing Muhammad and Jesus, meaning two figures, or the Quran and the Bible, two scriptures. This is not a wholly new comparative analogy. In the US context, Syed Hussein Nasser identified it in the 1960s in his book Ideals and Realities in Islam, and it's also been used by other scholars such as Schimmel and Daniel Madigan. Notably, and those who employ this theological analogy do so on the basis of their deep knowledge of the traditions and their frustration with what Madigan calls a confusion of categories that occurs with other analogies. What does he mean? He means that people who try, if you want to compare Muhammad and Jesus, and you do that comparison because it is two people, that's a valid comparison, but it is not a comparison based on the fact that those two figures occupy similar theological ground within the traditions. They don't. They occupy different theological space. This analogical starting point is deeply relevant to and fruitful for comparative feminist conversations among Muslim and Christian theologians. Why? Because when one looks at this analogy from the perspective of diverse concerns voiced by theologians, overlap is readily discernible. What are their concerns? What are their primary sites of struggle? What questions disturb them? The diverse responses to these questions reveal something striking. They point back to the analogy of the words. Even when the terminology and the concept of word, especially in Christian theology, feminist theology, even when the word or terminology or concept of word is challenged, the concerns in both traditions swirl around the divine being in the world in all of its contextual messiness and the way that value has been assigned to various markers of that worldly messiness. What do I mean? More concretely, similar concerns are raised in relation to the Quran and Jesus Christ, questions about divine inbreaking in a limited worldly or human form, questions about context, questions about historical contextualization and universal relevance, questions about patriarchy and maleness. I'm not going to talk about it today, but when you look into Christian feminist, womanist, mujerista discussions of the ontology of Jesus and what it means that Jesus is both male and human, it is a question about the divine, unlimited, being limited in a particular form and a form to which certain value has been assigned. The same questions exist about the Quran. No, it's not about the Quran being a human, but it is the Quran being related to God who's unlimited, and now it being limited in a particular form, and it bears the marks of patriarchy and of a patriarchal context, and what are we supposed to do with that? It's the same concern. All right. Based on this organic, albeit productively imperfect overlap in concerns, the analogy of the two divine words becomes an invaluable place to start a new conversation. So in the book, just quickly, I go through 5 of these analogical points, 3 of which derive directly from this analogy. So the first chapter in the book looks at divine ontology related to the Quran and related to Jesus Christ, and it brings up questions of hybridity, questions of authority, and especially the authority of human experience in relation to these is a big shared concern. The second topic that I take up here and place in conversation is I place biblical exegesis in conversation with the way that Islamic feminists deal with hadith, or shall I say don't deal with hadith. It's very important because most Islamic feminist scholarship in the US has been very Quran-centered, and of course that makes all sorts of sense, except there is the deconstructive argument that says, but we have to be able to deal with the hadith too. We can't just say that the hadith are the source of all the problems, because they are also all of the narratives that we are telling children, and they are also all of the place where all of our ritual comes from, right? I mean, so for instance, there's an example. The Quran says pray. It says pray kind of in the evening, in the afternoon, get up at night, pray at this time, don't pray at that time. But the actual how to pray, where do you put your arms? How do you, even the disputes, even that there's disputes over that, but all of those details come from the hadith. can't cast it off. And so this is like the burgeoning edge of Islamic feminist scholarship, is how to deal with the hadith. Now what's fascinating there is that there's a lot of overlap with decolonial biblical exegesis. There's a lot of strategies, and so I deal with that. The third area that extends this analogy is I talk about what are called the bearers of the word. And I write about the analogical overlaps between Prophet Muhammad and the Christian Virgin Mary. Now that's a fascinating conversation. Why? Because there is extensive scholarship feminist scholarship on Virgin Mary. There's extensive scholarship on purity. There's extensive scholarship on sex. There's extensive scholarship on maternity and all of that, and the cults of Mary. All of that exists. Well, let me rephrase it for you. There's extensive theological and exegetical scholarship that attends to the gendered and sexed reality of Mary. You know what there isn't? Extensive scholarship that attends to the gendered and sexed reality of Prophet Muhammad. Prophet Muhammad, in the book I write, I'm very explicit about this because it's something that matters to me, is that I have no interest in casting off the necessity of emulating the Sunnah. To me, that is an imperative. It's an imperative in practice. It's highly valuable. But there are interesting ways in which the Islamic tradition skirts the gender question. And we don't skirt the gender question, right? We live in a gendered world, diversely gendered, not binary gendered, but gendered nonetheless, right? And so it's fascinating to have a call to emulation that does not address some of the ways in which some of us will never be able to emulate certain aspects of that behavior. I can talk more about that later. It's not the topic I chose today, but it's a fascinating topic. The fourth one I talk about is theological anthropology, which I'll come back to in a second, and then I talk about ritual practice, specifically female prayer leadership, which I know is a hot button issue in Muslim communities, but I will say that I talk about female prayer leadership from the point of view of ritual theory, meaning what actually happens in ritual, and also from the point of view of historical analysis of what actually has happened in mosques. And so some of the assumptions about where women are, why women are in mosques, what's going on there, and some of the rhetoric around why women can't lead congregations. And I think that's important to unpack again because, just spoiler alert, I think that if communities want to have female prayer leadership, I'm in support of that. But I want to be very clear that my support of that derives from a concern for the communities. It derives out of a love of the tradition. It derives out of an analysis of the gendered normativity that was in play when people set down the fiqh rulings that said women could not. Because those people made rulings that barred women from leading prayer, and it wasn't innocuous why they made them. They were very clear about why they made them, and the things they said about women are probably not things we would say today. And so we have to grapple with that. So I like the diversity of opinions on it, but I really want to understand. So when someone comes out and says, well, the reason why women can't do this is because they are not rational, I'm like, oh my gosh. And there's people, we need to deal with that. So there's diversity of opinions there. So what I want to do in the last few minutes of actually talking is I want to just go into theological anthropology a little bit to give you a taste of what I do in the book. So theological anthropology is a prime site of much, do we know what theological anthropology is? Okay, it's kind of everything. That's what I say. It's everything that, that's my bias as a theologian. Theological anthropology just means like a theology about human nature, about what humans are like, what they're meant to do. So it can be the teleological purpose of humans, but it can also be the nature of humans. But it's also about their relationship to God, if there is a concept of God. So are they created? How are they created? What are they being asked to do? So there's a moral, ethical. So when I said it's kind of everything, right? Okay. Theological anthropology is a prime site of much feminist grappling in both traditions. It's also a prime site of less than productive comparative jabs across traditions. For example, U.S. Islamic feminist writings, early Islamic feminist writings, often claim their egalitarianism within Islamic traditions by referencing texts and in primary sources, but also by juxtaposing the Quran to other non-feminist Christian readings. So for instance, many early Islamic feminists would say, look at the Quran, it says there's one nafs divided into the one soul or something, divided into the two zawj, the two pairs. We don't have any of that biblical fall stuff. We don't have any of that Adam and Eve is deceptive stuff. It's a comparative jab. It also betrays a lack of understanding of the Bible, of Christianity, and of, that was my pen. It's okay, I frequently throw things around, so, not intensely like that. But it displays lack of even knowledge or awareness of feminist rereadings of those narratives. So for instance, someone like Phyllis Tribble is doing fabulous rereadings of this almost at the same exact time as these people are writing, or a decade or two earlier than some of these early Islamic feminists. So the lack of understanding. The contours of Islamic feminist theological anthropology are extremely positive and optimistic. Humans are created equal in the sight of God and in relation to each other. They are only distinguished from each other on the basis of taqwa, God consciousness, not on the basis of sex or gender. They can fulfill their purpose and manifest taqwa. Their basic human nature, fitra, begins in perfect relationship with God. And while this relationship certainly can be disturbed through forgetfulness and arrogance, the core of this human nature inclines towards God and can never be eradicated. This is a very positive theological anthropology. It is also a theological anthropology that is phenomenally well-rooted in primary texts and sources, and phenomenally well-suited to egalitarian argumentation. It is a theological anthropology on which I have based the majority of my constructive Muslim theological writing. And in the process of doing this comparative theological engagement, and being someone who is very much in the stream of articulating that kind of theological anthropology, that kind of view of humanity, questions arise. What kind of questions? This beautiful, empowering, in my view, human positive theological anthropology seems to gloss the realities of human constraint and limitation. To consider this question more fully, I turn to and engage with the book and in my own work with theological anthropology articulated by M. Sean Copeland, Dolores S. Williams, and Janine Hill Fletcher. These three Christian theologians focus specifically on issues of human freedom, suffering, embodiment, and systemic and relational constraint. Copeland and Williams do so by foregrounding the atrocities and survival strategies of Black women in slavery and post-slavery contexts. Copeland seeks to make the damage visible and proposes that a more realistic idea of the human, or the anthropological subject, is the exploited, despised, poor woman of color. By the way, let me just feed this in. What does she mean by realistic? She means that if you want to make an accounting of human reality, don't make the accounting of the free person who can do whatever they want. The reality of most people in the world is that they are despised, exploited, and oppressed by systems and other people. And so that's what she's saying, using slavery and post-slavery context. Williams describes this particular emphasis not as something that's just cathartic or representational, but as a theological corrective. It's very powerful language. She also emphasizes how the survival quality of life tradition centers female agency in the person of Hagar, I always want to smush them together. Hagar, yeah, see, I'm doing it. Hagar, and describes God's response not as liberation, as in black liberation theology, but as presence and participation in her survival. Hill Fletcher argues that the human condition is one in which relationality precedes the individual. We are always in relationship with other people. We never are just an individual person, autonomous, free. Constraint challenges our freedom, and interreligious knowledge can be sacred knowledge. I'm just giving you a snapshot into the work here. I've presented what is going on in Islamic feminist discourse, positive anthropology. What if we engage and learn about these other theological anthropologies? Pick 3 voices. I'm giving you a snapshot of what they're saying. These perspectives present a significant challenge to other Christian theological anthropologies and provide an invaluable dialogical lens for Muslimah reflections on the extent of freedom and capacity. So how does engagement with these perspectives impact Muslimah theology? What are some of the constructive Muslimah theological takeaways? I'm going to point briefly to 3, just by way of concluding. One is the theme of visibilization and invisibilization. Christian theologians ask what is rendered visible and invisible in dominant, even other feminist and liberation models of theological anthropology. Applying this question to Muslimah theology, it is clear that existing formulations emphasize individual freedom and capacity. In doing so, they stress ideal relationships between humans and between humans and God. However, claims to an aspirational ideal are not the same as attending to the descriptive reality on the ground, the real. A theological anthropology of freedom, choice, and capacity can be irrelevant and even oppressive to those who are not free, cannot choose, and are not capable. The complexities of constraint and relationality are somewhat obscured in existing Islamic feminist anthropologies, and I painfully admit that. But this is part of the fruit of this process, right? Come to the spots where you're forced to think even outside of where you want to think. So another takeaway, the second takeaway, relates to the subject or exemplar of theological anthropology. The central concept of fitra, human nature, puts forth a fairly robust idea of unrestrained autonomy and individuality. One way it does so is through connection to the model of Ibrahim, or Abraham, who becomes the exemplar of a fitra-based theological anthropology. By the way, the exemplar for Prophet Muhammad, too. So in the Quran, Prophet Muhammad is told, be like Abraham. See, I'm doing it again, my conflation. Ibrahim, right? So that's when the bells go off and we say, oh, important figure. Fine. The Quran describes Ibrahim in this way and utilizes his story to explicate the contours of what it means to naturally incline towards God. Ibrahim knows God and obeys God. Ibrahim comes to know God primarily through actualization of his fitra, as manifest in rational reflection on the natural and cultural world surrounding him, reflecting on the stars, the moon, the sun. He reasons that God couldn't be like any of these things, but rather must be greater than each of them. Ibrahim also reflects on the practices and beliefs of his society and of his father. He sees them worshiping idols that can't speak, respond, or help. He, based on his fitra-based reasoning, rejects these practices, his father, and the ways of his people. He is entangled in social, familial, and ideological constraints, but he is able to extricate himself completely from these constraints. And this ability is extensively praised. As I said before, Abraham is the model of what Prophet Muhammad should be. The exemplary model of Ibrahim thus promotes the idea that people can escape embodied realities of relationality and constraint. While I find this Ibrahim-centric theological anthropology empowering in the way that it validates basic individual human integrity irrespective of context, it also fails to grapple sufficiently with constraint and can thus function as a sort of ideological or theological rugged individualism. If you just work hard enough, you'll get it. You're not pious enough. That's why you're not giving up on your ways. It does not attend to the reality of how we are situated. How many of you in this room think you could reject everything in your family, your culture, your society? You know that children are taught to think before they can even speak, right? Our categories are shaped even before we're able to assert agency linguistically. I love this account, especially valuable for women. You know, everybody can do it. But here's the issue. We can't. So what do we do? And this is the last point I want to make just briefly. And I'll talk more about it maybe if people are interested to go deep. And this is the question of, could there be another exemplar? The answer to this in the book comes from an overlap in the writings of Williams and Wadud. They both turn to Hagar or Hajar as an alternate example. And we know this move fairly well. But what is fascinating about this move from a comparative angle is that it's not just the same figure. Hajar, and I'll speak from the Islamic tradition, Hajar is much like Hagar, abandoned, surviving, sun, wilderness, desert, we can mash that up a little bit, active, doing stuff, rejected, oppressed, certainly not free, right? She is not free. But this is what's interesting. She's not exactly the same in both traditions either. The Islamic Hajar is, in a fascinating way, the hyper-visible exemplar. So she's not Hagar, who no one talks about and is abandoned in the wilderness. She's Hajar, who everybody knows about, but nobody cares about. Everybody knows. People run in Hajj. There's a rite in Hajj, the sa'i, where you run and you run in her steps. What are you running for? She's running to try to find water for her child who's about to die. Everybody who goes on pilgrimage to Mecca has to do that, or your Hajj is not complete. But as Wadud reminds us, we don't reflect on that. We know it without accounting for the experience, without prioritizing the experience. She is ritually centered. She is hyper-visible. She's unfortunately romantically praised and flattened romantically. She becomes the epitome of faith, rather than a woman who is struggling, surviving, an agent, active, in dialogue with God, not free. If you pick her up as an alternate example, an alternate exemplar in theological anthropology, we have a totally different situation. Many of the facets I just said, but let me close with this facet. She's all those things. Agent, in relation. She's struggling for herself. She's struggling for her child. But look, she has to find a way, and Janine Hill-Fletcher uses this term, to manifest creativity within the constraints in which she is situated. What would it look like to have the model of a human being not be, you can be free of everything that holds you back, and so follow this one path, but rather, this is where you are, and how creative can you be given the situation you find yourself in? They refer to it as her deviance, not her normativity. The way that she is improper, not proper. It's very important to feminist theology because what it does is it takes a theological anthropology model that does not put forth a singular norm of behavior, but puts forth an acknowledgement of the way that we are constrained, and we're not all constrained the same way. My introduction acknowledged that, right? We're constrained differently. But we can exercise creativity. Now here's the final piece that's fascinating about her. If we pay attention to her, if we center her, if we let her be an exemplar, not a romantic one, a gritty one, she also makes a demand on the rest of us. Not just to run in her footsteps, not just to say, oh, like the mother, Hajar. I want men to be like Hajar. I want I don't even want to say men or women, I want people to be like Hajar. She makes a demand on us. She demands us to help make other people's constraints less and allow them to have more creativity. She places a social demand on us. Ibrahim, the demand that is placed is work harder and you'll get free. Hajar, the demand that is placed is work your butt off with everything you have, every ounce of prayer and action and creativity you can muster, and everybody else around, you better work for her too. It's a social demand, social conscientization, that fabulous theological word. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Thank you so much. Appreciate you listening.
We have time, I think, for a few questions. If you could wait to get the microphone, because in this room you really need to use the mic so that everyone can hear the question.
Oh, that's you both.
I want to say thank you for that. That was beautiful. I just have a question for you. I think at the heart of your talk this evening, you said your motivation is coming from a communal response or a communal need for this like theology. And I want to ask you, can your theology be framed as an Islamic pastoral theology? Because it sounds very pastoral.
No, so I love this question. Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate this question. I would say that in the line of feminists and liberation and womanists and muharista, and this line of theologies, sometimes people call them contextual theologies. By the way, teacher moment, show me a theology that's not contextual. There are theologies that say they're contextual and others that obscure that they're contextual, but they're all contextual. But in that line, the end game for me is what's happening to people and communities on the ground, because that affects their ability to be in relationship with God. So in that way, I think that's very pastoral. And so I am very well aware that some of the things that I may say they're not always well received just so when I said the thing about female prayer leadership, I'm very well aware of the tensions around that. And I invite people to read what I've written on it. Because the primary motivation there is a love of the tradition and a love of people in the tradition, as well as in other traditions. It's not like an exclusivist thing, but it's an attending to that. So I think in that way, it is very pastoral. This book is a book for the people I meet every day in communities who don't feel like they're seen. And whether that's because of their gender identity, because of their biological sex, because of their racial identity, because of their ethnic identity, and I'm just talking in Muslim communities now, they don't feel like they're represented. They feel harmed. It seems like the last place that we should be harming people, this is such an ironic statement to say in this country at this time, but the last place that should be sites of harm are communities, right? Those should be sites of flourishing. And so one of the things that I talk about in the final chapter when I talk about ritual prayer, which is very much about ritual and pastoral concerns, is the imperative in Muslim communities of, and this is kind of in conversation with Tracy West and her discussion of Black church and the difference between Black church and what's going on at church. I talk about the importance of Muslim communities restating and asserting the idea of a space between an ideal ummah, meaning community, Muslim community, and the real ummahs we have. So we're all aiming towards an ideal, but we're not that ideal, right? We're never that ideal. But when we think we're that ideal, we cause harm because we tell everyone else they're wrong. But if we're trying to be that ideal, then we listen. Then when someone says, it hurts me to have this experience, you go, I don't want you to be hurt. But all too often we go, you're just not pious enough. If you were pious, you wouldn't feel hurt. That's why Hajar is so important. She was hurt, and she's pious, right? Can be both. You can be abandoned. You can yell at God and still be pious. She did. It's okay. It's not a bad thing to say that. It's a real thing. So there is a pastoral moment. So I appreciate that.
Thank you so much. My question is about a couple of terms that you've used in your book and in your lecture, and how they might relate to this question of women-led prayer, which I think also relates to the interreligious debate, for example, that Catholics have with regard to women in the priesthood. You mentioned transformative taqwa, or transformative God consciousness. And you also talk about a key concept, I think, in your theology is the authority of human experience. And I think those are related closely. And I'd love to know how those concepts might relate to how we deal with the question in Islam of women-led prayer, or perhaps priesthood in Catholicism.
Yeah, so they are very much related, and they are very centered to the whole book. They're, in fact, two threads that run throughout pretty much all of the topics that I am dealing with. So let me start with human experience. I think when I was talking about the first chapter is on Quran and Jesus, and it's talking about the analogy there. What I'm trying to work through there is the question of human experience. Does it matter? Does our human experience matter? And, as I've tried to be honest with you all today, especially on the question of theological anthropology, look, I don't have any interest in writing a book where I'm like, I'm right, I know everything, I sit down, I know it. I don't know how other people write, but to me, the point in writing is that's the work. It's an exploration. I don't know everything I'm going to write when I sit down and write a book. This book was an idea. This book was, I've had these experiences where my eyes have been opened by engaging and learning deeply about diverse Christian voices. And that doesn't mean that I've been like, they do that, let me do that. I hope I communicated that. It's not that. They're asking this question, is it relevant? Oh, no, it's not relevant. Is it relevant? Yeah, it's relevant. Is it relevant? Kind of relevant, not so relevant. It's a discerning process. But it's like when you're in conversation with I'd say good friend, but also someone you don't know anything about. And you say, oh wow, I've never had that experience before. Do I want to have that experience? No. Should I have that experience? Maybe. Maybe not. It's okay to say no. Comparative feminist theology leaves a whole big space for no. And in this work, there's a lot of no's. I write about it in the book. I'm like, this is not relevant. It's not relevant. So the reason why I'm saying that is that with the question of authority of human experience, in many ways, especially today, I think in theological circles, but in other circles, we just simply say that human experience is relevant. It's taken for granted that it is relevant. But we don't attend to the relativistic shadow of that. What do I mean? Well, is all human experience relevant? Because certainly, women want to foreground human experience, and people who have been marginalized want to foreground that their experience counts too. But if you make the argument that all human experience is authoritative, where do you draw your boundaries? Is every experience authoritative? Because there's some that I, as a Muslim theologian, want to say are not authoritative. So I want to say that patriarchal interpretations of the Quran are not as authoritative. They are possible, but not as authoritative. So why am I saying this? I try to work through some of the parameters of this. Who gets to say what experience is authoritative? Does some experience count more? How do we know it when we meet it? Because it is actually possible that sometimes I encounter something in my tradition that my experience of it is I don't like it, right? But not everything that I encounter in my tradition that I have an experience of not liking is bad for me. But some of it is. Like, so for instance, some days I'm like, oh, it's 4, I don't really want to get up and pray, it doesn't feel good to me. But my experience doesn't matter. I mean, it matters, but it's not driving that conversation. Because I know enough about the ritual prayer to know that it is doing something to me and I am not the sole agent. I've agreed to participate because I know that there's something going on there. But there are other places where human experience really does matter. And the best example for this, and I write about it in the book, is Quran 434, where it's talking extensively about men having the right to hit a woman. And I am very well versed in all the Islamic feminist interpretations of that verse. And I also want to very much acknowledge that that's probably one of the 6 or 7 problematic verses along that line in the entirety of the Quran. So the quantity is limited, but because of the stature of the Quran, akin to Jesus Christ, divine, incarnate, right? Because of the stature of the Quran, the magnitude of that being in it is so problematic, right? If it was just a text, we'd be like, oh, text, patriarchal context, move it along, nothing to say, nothing to see here. But it's not, so it's absorbed so much energy because we have to explain why God would let that be there. And there's a lot of Islamic feminist scholarship on dealing with that. And for me, there are linguistic maneuvers. I don't think they're as strong. There are contextual limitations. There's a patriarchal context. This was going on. Prophet Muhammad didn't like it. We could use the Sunnah to limit it. All these kind of maneuvers. But I'm interested in a maneuver that's not often talked about. And that is that I want to hear from the person who's been hit, how they feel when they encounter that verse. That's authoritative to me. Does that mean it's not part of the Quran? No. Actually, I write about it in the book, I say it is part of the Quran, but our charge now is to grapple with that piece of revelation using human experience. We should use that not as the verse we skip over really fast because we don't want to deal with it. We should use that as the invitation to hear from people who have been abused, to understand their constraint, their oppression, the impact of that. Okay? So this working out authority of experience is really important, but it's not simple because experience matters so deeply, but it's not the only authoritative component. And so how that just quickly relates to transformative taqwa is that taqwa, I mentioned, God consciousness, it's the most praised trait in the Quran of what humans can be. It's very complicated. Read my first book, that's all it's about. But what I try to do in this book is say that often we talk about God consciousness as like you just have God consciousness or you work towards God consciousness. What I want to say is that this kind of God consciousness is not just, I'll say to my students, it's not just this is hierarchical, so go with it. It's not just a God-human thing. Like, I'm conscious of God, I believe in God. It's not that. Taqwa necessitates social action, so it's always this and this thing. You say you believe in God, show me an action with other people. What I'm trying to get at with transformative taqwa is it's not enough to just believe and act socially. We gotta believe and transform socially. So I don't want to just give you charity. I want to make it so you don't need the charity too. And not just by saying, work harder. I want to change the structures. What if taqwa called us to disassemble white supremacy? What if that's what it called us to? To know it and to work to pull it apart. To distance our privilege. To know how it functions. So that's what I'm getting at with a transformative. But also very hinged experience, right? Because how do you get to know what it is? Gotta listen. And step aside, right? Other questions? She's coming. I'm sorry for the creaking stage. It's like a little...
No, we're sorry. You talked about, I'll use the word Hagar, but because I
don't speak Arabic, and how she felt. But how did the man feel who hit that person?
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting question, right? I mean, that would be part of, to me, that's part of the when I say that we should be, if we're going to talk about experience being authoritative in relation to divine revelation, which is what we're talking about here, right? If we're talking about something in the Quran and how we experience it, then that experience is relevant too. And how does that person get there? And where are they coming from? And why is that happening? You want to talk about transformative taqwa, and you want to talk about, if you know anything about sociology or psychology or social work, people hitting other people, it's, yeah. I'll just leave it there. I say that experience is relevant to here too. I'm not, yeah. Have a question?
Thank you so much. I really have, I feel like I'm learning so much, both from the content of what you're presenting, but also in how you're presenting it and the care with which you're approaching your work. And there's something here that I find difficult for myself and my own scholarship. You brought it up in a subtle way, but an important way. You talked about when we make comparisons, and you brought up the Phyllis Tribble as an example, that sometimes we're making these comparisons and we're comparing our own tradition, say, with the biblical interpretation, and yet that biblical interpretation might in fact be the wrong, not a full interpretation, because we haven't looked at really important voices like Phyllis Tribble. And I've noticed a few times you're being careful in your use of names like Ibrahim and Abraham. Mm-hmm. And as an example, what if you've done, you're using this care, but then you realize what you're excluding perhaps also says something. So in all these comparisons, you're such careful work, and yet someone might approach you and say, well, what about Avraham instead of Ibrahim or Abraham? You're really, your comparison is really to a very Protestant centric interpretation of those biblical texts, which are very Christianized, but they're in fact Hebrew texts that are Jewish. Do you have any thoughts on how do we not become paralyzed because you can never do anything because you're never, you can't cover it all, but how do you approach it? I feel like you've got a pretty sophisticated way of approaching this. You're doing it well, but what else can we learn, and what are you learning about this?
Yeah, so, I mean, part of the reason why I walked you through the woods on the comparative feminist theology methodology is some of us like that stuff, and it's really important. But the key there, I mean, is knowledge, right? And knowledge first, which is a commitment, by the way. And so one of the ways I talk about it in the book is it's a commitment of accountability. The people I write about in this book, both my colleagues and friends, and many of them are friends who I disagree with or agree with, and I feel like I'm charged to hold their contributions gently. There's accountability. So this is maybe part of my answer to your question. One cannot do everything. One should never attempt to do everything because that's the quick road to doing nothing, right? But can you do it with accountability? And what does that look like? Knowledge, commitment, conscientiousness. And I think also clarity about what you are and are not doing. This book is not a Muslim-Christian comparison of Abraham. It's me talking to very specific scholars who come from different, yes, some of them are very Protestant, some of them are very Catholic, some of them are coming out of this context, and all of that has to be attended to in order to do the kind of careful scholarship. And so Francis Clooney, I think, says it right. I mean, small acts of comparison. It's like really good advice for students, right? What do you want to write your final paper on? Well, I want to write my final paper on, Muhammad and like that. No, I mean, you want to write it on minutia. So focus, conscientiousness and accountability. And also there's other people to do more work. So that's the good story, right? Like, there's other work to be done. There's other comparisons to be made. And while, for instance, I don't take in this book, I say that I'm not going to do the Bible, Quran stuff. There's vast amounts of wonderful scholarship on that. It just comes from a very different place than what I'm trying to do in this. I'm not dismissing it, it's just not my work. Now, to the question about these texts being in other traditions, what I can say to that is that I have not had the time or taken the time or expanded my capacities to know those texts and Jewish traditions well enough to conscientiously engage them. So at this point, that is not my work. But I will tell you a story, and that is that I always have students from JTS in my class when I teach comparative feminist theology, and it makes the conversation so much richer. Why? Because the dynamics of constraint and oppression are even more complex. So for instance, you get Islamic and Christian texts being like, and Sarah, that's the bad one, right? Like, she's the bad one. And then when I have my students from JTS in the room, they're like, oh God, she was just as oppressed and constrained and everything's complicated. And, so it's more. And so I think that's the best way I can answer it. But one cannot do everything. No? So precision, maybe. I thought you were taking the microphone to my daughter, and I was like, God help us all.
Well, we can do that. Would you like it? Thank you very much. That was challenging and engaging, and you're a terrific teacher and speaker.
Thank you.
You teach at what has historically been, traditionally been, one of the most vibrant, exciting, diverse, interesting theological schools in the country, and I assume it still is. I wish you could just say a bit about your students, what they bring to this conversation, what do they want to know? What is it that is going to be important as they formulate their own theologies?
Great. Great. Thank you so much for that question. I think I've been at Union now for 7 years, which is odd. And recently tenured, first Muslim professor tenured at Union, so that's exciting. And it is all those things. It is exciting and vibrant and, I would say, intense and challenging. And there's not what Union is there is no square footage where there is no challenge. So everything is challenged. So when I say conscientiousness, that is very important. But see, you also need to be able to say something, not just clarify, no, what you're not saying. I'm not doing this, and I'm speaking from here, and I'm not speaking from there. Okay, but what are you saying? You also have to be able to say something. So it's exciting to try to figure out that dynamic. Something about the students. The students at Union are diverse, and they come for all different reasons. It is increasingly interreligious. We have started 2 years ago, we have an MDiv track in Islam and interreligious engagement, and we have an MDiv track in Buddhism and interreligious engagement. And so that's very important because it's a very formal commitment to those contingencies. Those students who come to those programs are, I think it's very particular what they're coming from, because it's not an Islamic studies focus or a Buddhist studies. It is a 3-point focus on the tradition, deep interreligious knowledge, and a concern for social disparity issues. So we might call them social justice issues, but racism, incarceration, poverty, the ecological crisis, these kind of things. So students come very much with those kind of concerns. Increasingly, like at many seminaries, our students are not necessarily affiliated. Many of them are post-Christian, Christian adjacent, but not necessarily affiliated. And so that's seminary population. There's a lot of writing on that. And that's fascinating because they might be impelled by the sense that there is something to garner from religious traditions and something to garner from spiritual practices to help fight against these concerns and challenges. So we have many students who come from organizing backgrounds, who come from journalism backgrounds, who come from mental health backgrounds that are looking to augment their capacity, both personal and professional, with the type of training we offer in traditions, but also in critiques of those traditions. Trying to figure out what students need is, that's kind of the love and bane of my life, right? I mean, that's my favorite. I love writing, I love theology, but teaching that's the best thing. Figuring out how to hear what a student needs, maybe convince them that they need something else too, and help them get there. That's great. I think one thing I'm also, in addition to my specific focus on what I've talked about today, I do the primary work in interreligious engagement at Union. So I teach the foundational classes in trying to cultivate competencies for people to engage interreligiously. So what I would say, one thing that most of our students need is that. They need not just knowledge of other traditions, but they need to be sensitized to interreligious dynamics, some of the stuff that I've talked about today, but they need to unpack questions of religious privilege. They need to unpack questions of how religions are tied to race and racism. They need to understand ethnic dynamics. They need to understand the role of ritual practice in their lives or not in their lives, and how it could be totally different in another tradition. And since some of our students will go out and do social work or mental health work or education, it's increasingly imperative or they'll be chaplains, because none of those students will ever work in a singular religious tradition. Those environments don't exist anymore. So how can they go out and not create harm? That's some of what we do. That's helpful.
Well, I think we're going to wrap it up there. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much. Appreciate it.
And I want to encourage people to buy the book, which is right over here, and I hope Jerusha will stay and sign some of them. We do have it at a steep discount, even